There is a scan on my laptop screen right now. 13 lines of text on a fragment of papyrus that is approximately 1600 years old. The ink is faded at the edges, where the papyrus fibers have frayed, darker in the center, where the fibers are denser and the ink held. The letters vary in size, a delta that nearly doubles the height of the alpha next to it. Word breaks are irregular. Some lines run close to the edge, as if the writer was not entirely sure how much space he had. If I hadn't read the abstract first, I would have scrolled past it. And that, it turns out, is exactly what happened for 60 years. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. The paper I'm reading was published in the Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik in 2024. The authors are Dr. Lajos Berkes of Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and Professor Gabriel Nochi Macedo of the Université de Liège. Its subject: a recently identified Greek papyrus fragment of the infancy Gospel of Thomas. I found it the way I find most things I end up spending weeks with, an academic humanities newsletter, not one I read for specific leads. The kind that lands in your inbox when you have been following early Christian textual history long enough that someone, somewhere, put you on a list. It was a Tuesday. I was finishing lunch. Leftover soup going cold at the edge of the desk. The notification came through. The word Hamburg in the headline is what made me open it, not because it sounded extraordinary, because it sounded small. A library in Hamburg, not Qumran, not Nag Hammadi, not a desert cave with sealed jars and the weight of centuries. A library with a catalogue number. I opened it expecting a footnote. I did not finish the soup. Before I tell you what P.Hamb.Graec.1011 says, I need to tell you what it is, because there is a confusion that almost everyone runs into, and I want to clear it up before we go further. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is not the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is the collection of 114 sayings discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. It contains no narrative, no miracles, no childhood account. It is a collection of isolated sayings attributed to Jesus. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is a different text entirely, a narrative document, written approximately in the 2nd century of the Common Era. It covers the childhood of Jesus from age 5 to age 12, and it exists because of a silence. Luke chapter 2 verse 52. 4 words. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature. That is all the canonical record gives you for the 18 years between the birth narrative and the baptism by John. 4 words. 18 years compressed into a subordinate clause. Early Christians were not satisfied with that silence. They had intense curiosity about who Jesus was as a child, where he grew up, what he learned, what he did. The infancy Gospel of Thomas filled that gap. It circulated widely in antiquity, in Egypt, in Syria, in Ethiopia. Communities across the Mediterranean world read it, copied it, transmitted it. It was not a fringe text. It was a document that early Christians engaged with seriously. The Gelasian Decree, compiled around 500 of the Common Era, listed the infancy Gospel of Thomas among texts deemed dangerous. The text as a whole. But the damage was already done. Or rather, the forgetting was already underway. Within a few generations after the canonical list was fixed, most Christians simply did not know the infancy Gospel of Thomas had existed. Not because it was dramatically suppressed, because it was not included, and what is not included stops being transmitted. And what stops being transmitted stops being known. Before Berkes and Macedo published their identification in 2024, the oldest known physical manuscript of any part of the infancy Gospel of Thomas was an 11th century codex. P.Hamb.Graec.1011 is from the 4th to 5th century of the Common Era, 600 to 700 years earlier. The oldest surviving physical evidence of a childhood miracle of Jesus had been classified as an ordinary document and was sitting in a German university library. You know the story. You have known it since before you could read it yourself. Born in a manger in Bethlehem, shepherds in the fields, a star in the east. wise men with gifts, Egypt for a time. Then Nazareth, Luke chapter 2 verses 41 through 52, the one story from the childhood. Jesus at 12 in the temple, sitting with the teachers, his parents searching for 3 days. Then nothing. He grew up in Nazareth. He learned carpentry. He worked with his hands. He grew in wisdom and in stature. 4 words. Then the Jordan River, John the Baptist, the dove descending, the voice from heaven, the wilderness for 40 days. And then Cana, the wedding, the water into wine, his first sign as John calls it. Chapter 2 verse 11, the beginning. That is the story you were taught. That is the story every Sunday school class, every confirmation program, every catechism session handed you. Birth. 1 story at 12. 4 words for 18 years. Baptism. Miracles begin. If you ever asked what happened during those 18 years, you were given Luke 2 verse 52. He grew in wisdom and in stature, as if those 4 words were an answer. As if the most consequential life in the history of Western civilization was appropriately compressed into a subordinate clause, and no further questions were expected. You stopped asking, not because you were incurious, because asking felt like questioning something that was not meant to be questioned. The blank childhood was not a silence that invited investigation. It was a silence that expected compliance. You complied. Everyone did. That was the point. Now let me tell you how P.Hamb.Graec.1011 ended up classified as a shopping list. At some point in the 20th century, the Hamburg Karl von Ossietzky State and University Library acquired a collection of papyrus fragments. Standard archival material, the kind that flows into university collections over decades. P.Hamb.Graec.1011 was catalogued, given an inventory number, filed as what it appeared to be an ordinary document, possibly a school exercise, possibly a shopping list. That is the phrase Berkes and Macedo use in their published identification. Possibly a school exercise, possibly a shopping list, not a religious text, not a manuscript of a suppressed gospel, not the oldest surviving physical evidence of a childhood miracle of Jesus. And it sat there, for decades, in a secular university library in Hamburg, Germany, on a shelf, under a catalogue number, while nobody with the specific expertise to recognize what it was happened to look closely at the handwriting. Now here is the part that stops me. Dr. Lajos Berkes is a papyrologist at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. Professor Gabriel Nocci Macedo is a papyrologist at the Université de Liège. They were not specialists in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. They were not scholars whose research had led them to search for early manuscripts of this text. They were papyrologists working on a digitization project. They were processing fragments, running comparisons against digitized databases of early Christian texts. And in P.Hamb.Graec.1011, in line 11, one of them noticed a name. Jesus. And then cross-referenced the surrounding lines against the database, and found the match. The world's leading specialist on the infancy Gospel of Thomas is Tony Burke, professor at York University in Toronto, author of the standard scholarly edition of the text. He has spent his academic career on this material. He was not in that room. He was not the one who found it. He was contacted after the identification. He was told. The specialist had to be reached by 2 researchers who were not looking for what they found. The text survived in disguise, and the disguise held for 60 years, right up until 2 papyrologists doing routine digitization work happened to recognize a name in line 11 of a document nobody had looked at twice. That is the discovery mechanism, not a dramatic archaeological excavation, not a scholar on a quest, a digitization project, a name in a line, a database cross-reference, and 60 years of misfiling ended in an afternoon. 13 lines of Greek text. That is what P.Hamb.Graec.1011 contains. The passage comes from chapter 2 of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It is the episode scholars call the clay sparrows. Jesus is 5 years old. He is at a stream. It is the Sabbath. He has gathered soft clay from the banks of the stream. He has been shaping it with his hands. What he has made when Joseph arrives are 12 small birds. Joseph sees him. Joseph is the earthly father, the carpenter from Nazareth, the man who raised this child, the man who had been told by an angel in Matthew chapter 1 that his betrothed carried the Son of God. Joseph had that information, and Joseph still looks at his 5-year-old son making clay figures on the Sabbath and says exactly what any father would say. "Why are you doing such things on the holy Sabbath?" That is Joseph's line. That is his response. A correction, a rebuke. What you say to a child who is doing something he should know better than to do. The child looks at him, he claps his hands, and the 12 clay sparrows lift off his palms and fly. The papyrus does not describe them flying away into the distance. It does not give Joseph an elaborate reaction. It says, Joseph said nothing further. I have read that phrase more times than I can count this week. Joseph said nothing further. The earthly father of God corrected God for violating the Sabbath. God listened, and then did what he was going to do anyway. And the father said nothing further. There is no celebration in that phrase. There is no awe. There is no, my son, I should not have doubted you. There is a silence. The silence of a man who has just understood something that does not fit inside any category of fatherhood he was prepared for. The birds are gone. The Sabbath is still the Sabbath. The clay is still on the ground. And Joseph said nothing further. You are standing at the edge of a stream. It is a Saturday. The Sabbath. The day of rest. The day God set apart. The day that has structured the week of your people for longer than anyone in your family can trace back. You have come to find your son. He is in the mud at the water's edge. His hands are gray with clay. You can see what he has been making. 12 of them, small, carefully shaped, sitting in a row. You are not angry. You are doing what fathers do. You tell him, this is the Sabbath. You tell him, this is not the day for making things. You tell him, come away from the mud. He is 5 years old. He looks at you. He claps his hands. And the 12 birds lift off his palms. Not a trick, not something that needs explaining. They lift off and they fly and they are gone. You are still standing there, with the clay on the ground where they were, with the sound of your own voice still in the air. He heard you. He let you finish, and then he did what he was going to do. You are the father. You have carried this child. You have worried for him, and protected him, and taught him. You were told before he was born who he was. And you are standing in the mud on the Sabbath, looking at the place where 12 clay birds used to be, with nothing left to say. The afternoon is still in front of you. What do you do with it? Now I want to talk about why this text ended up on a shelf in Hamburg, with no one looking at it. Because the mechanism is not what you might expect. There was no emergency council called to deal with the infancy gospel of Thomas. There was no specific decree targeting the clay sparrows episode. There was no bishop who stood up and said, this text is dangerous, burn every copy. What happened was quieter than that. In 363 of the Common Era, the Council of Laodicea met. Among the things they produced, a list of books approved for public reading in churches. The infancy gospel of Thomas was not on that list, not specifically condemned, not burned, simply not included, and what is not included in the approved list is not read aloud. And what is not read aloud is not transmitted to the next generation. And what is not transmitted stops being known, and what stops being known, after enough generations, might as well not exist. Within the mainstream of what became Orthodox Christianity, the infancy gospel of Thomas was apocryphal. Something that existed vaguely somewhere, not something you encountered in catechism class, not something your priest read from the pulpit. Within a few generations, most Christians did not know it had existed. Now here is the part I need you to hear. While Christianity was losing track of the infancy gospel of Thomas, while the text was being misfiled and forgotten and classified as shopping lists in German university libraries, another tradition was preserving the miracle it described in canonical scripture. The Quran, in Surah 3, verse 49, reads, I will create for you from clay the form of a bird, then I will breathe into it and it will be a bird by God's permission. Surah 5, verse 110. When you made from clay the form of a bird by my permission, then you breathed into it, and it became a bird by my permission. That is the clay bird's miracle. In Islam's canonical scripture, described as a genuine miracle of Jesus, preserved for 1,400 years, recited by approximately 1.8 billion people. The oldest physical manuscript of that miracle was sitting in a Hamburg library under the inventory number P.Hamb.Graec.1011. Neither tradition knew that. The Islamic tradition did not have the papyrus. The Christian tradition did not have the canonical scripture that preserved the miracle. The oldest physical evidence of a moment Islam treats as authentic was filed in a German secular university that neither religion controlled, and it was classified as a shopping list. I want to be careful about how I frame what I am about to tell you, because it is easy to hear the story of P.Hamb.Graec.1011 and arrive at the word conspiracy. And I think that word misses what actually happened. It gives the suppression mechanism more credit than it deserves. It assumes an active decision, a meeting, a decree, an intention. The Church did not need to suppress the infancy gospel of Thomas. The structure of Orthodox Christology did the work for it. John chapter 2 verse 11. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee. The first of his signs. That is how John describes the wedding at Cana, the water into wine, the beginning. Every major Christian tradition presents Jesus' public ministry, beginning around age 30, as the beginning of his miraculous activity, 30 years of life, compressed into 4 words in Luke. Then the baptism. Then the signs begin. The theological architecture requires a silent childhood, not because anyone decided to silence it, because the adult miracles carry their weight only if they are inaugural. Think about what the clay sparrows do to the wedding at Cana. If Jesus had been animating matter since he was 5 years old, making clay birds breathe and fly at a stream in Galilee while his father watched, then the wedding at Cana is not his first sign. It is not the beginning. It is not the inaugural moment. It is a performance by someone who has been doing this for 25 years. The weight of Cana depends entirely on the disciples believing they are witnessing the first demonstration. A 5-year-old Jesus with full uncontrolled omnipotence does not just complicate the childhood. He dismantles the architecture. If he had divine power at age 5, Luke 2 verse 52, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature, is not a description of genuine human development. It is a cover story. Joseph correcting God for working on the Sabbath and God listening before doing what he was going to do anyway is not compatible with a Jesus whose public ministry requires that no sign had been given before the Jordan River. J.J. Benitez has spent 40 years examining the institutional structure of Christian teaching through the lens of the historical record. His observation, preserved across decades of interviews and 10 volumes of Caballo de Troya, does not require you to accept his methodology. It stands on the canonical record alone. He has put it this way: the architecture of institutional religion requires that its founder begin his work on the institution's schedule, not his own. Not a conspiracy. A structural necessity. The Church did not suppress the clay sparrows because someone decided they were dangerous. The Church stopped transmitting the clay sparrows because the theological architecture it had built over 3 centuries could not accommodate a founder who started early. And when the physical evidence of that early start turned up in a Hamburg filing cabinet, it had been misfiled for so long that nobody recognized what it was. This Sunday, wherever you go, or used to go, or drive past on the way to somewhere else on Sunday mornings without stopping anymore, there will be a sermon. The pastor or priest will stand at the front of the room with the book open on the stand. They will speak about a miracle, probably one of the adult miracles, water into wine at Cana, 5,000 people fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish, Lazarus at the entrance of the tomb, still wrapped in linen. They will not mention the clay sparrows. They will not stop at Luke 2 verse 52 and say, "Here are 18 years of silence. Here is what we do not know. Here is what early Christians were so curious about that they wrote texts to fill it, and those texts circulated for centuries before being quietly excluded from public reading." They will not mention that somewhere in Hamburg, in the Karl von Ossietzky State and University Library, there is a fragment of papyrus from the 4th or 5th century that was filed as an ordinary document for 60 years. They will not mention that the handwriting on that fragment is so irregular a delta nearly twice the height of the alpha next to it, word breaks in the wrong places, ink faded at the edges, that the scholars who catalogued it assumed it was a school exercise. They will not mention that the oldest physical evidence of a childhood miracle of Jesus survived because it looked like homework. The sermon will proceed, the hour will pass, you will drive home. And somewhere in Hamburg, in a library with a catalogue number, the papyrus will still be there, still in the archive, still in the collection, filed correctly now, after 60 years of being something else. The oldest copy of the miracle nobody told you about. I want to go back to that Tuesday lunch, leftover soup at the edge of the desk, the notification, Hamburg in the headline. I opened the paper because the headline sounded small, not because it promised a revelation, because a library in Hamburg sounded like administrative news, the kind of thing a humanities newsletter covers that nobody else does. I scrolled to the scan. 13 lines, Greek text. The handwriting is genuinely difficult. I am not a papyrologist, but I can see what Burks and Macedo mean when they describe it as possibly a school exercise. The letters are not consistent. The spacing is uneven. If you showed this to someone who did not know what it was, they would tell you it was a student's practice work, someone learning to write. I kept thinking about the 60 years while I looked at it. 60 years that fragment sat in that library, under its catalogue number, on its shelf, in the archive, while scholars in textual history and early Christian studies worked 20 feet away, or in buildings across the city, or in universities across Europe, and nobody who walked past that shelf had the specific background to recognize what was on the page. The Vatican did not hide P.Hamb.Graec.1011. The Church did not suppress it. The theological tradition that classified the infancy Gospel of Thomas as apocryphal did not act against this fragment. A secular institution was simply indifferent to its content. A library catalogued what it saw, and what it saw was bad handwriting. And for 60 years, the oldest physical manuscript of a 5-year-old Jesus making clay birds come to life on the Sabbath sat in a filing system that had no category for what it actually was. I looked at the scan for a long time. I did not finish the soup. What I kept coming back to was not the theological implication, not the Christological problem, not the question of what this does to the wedding at Cana. It was the handwriting. If the scribe who copied this in the 4th or 5th century had been more careful, if the letters had been more consistent, the word breaks cleaner, the lines more even, this would have attracted attention sooner. The miracle of the clay bird survived inside the disguise of a bad penmanship grade. The text was hiding where nobody would look, not because anyone put it there, because bad handwriting is invisible, because a document that looks like a shopping list does not get read twice. That is the suppression mechanism, not a burning, not a decree, a filing cabinet and a clumsy scribe, and 2 papyrologists who weren't looking for it. The Hamburg catalogue entry now reads something different than it did before 2024. The papyrus is still there. Same library, same archive. The oldest known physical manuscript of a childhood miracle of Jesus. Correctly identified at last. 60 years after it arrived. I'll let you sit with that. This is Nathan Forbidden Gospels.